most of them.
Who are they?
Well, there's a few exceptions, but
no, but who are they? I mean,
today
they're all programmed and packaged the same way.
Chuck Percy. See, there's an exception to every rule.
Well, you take George Bush. He's not an interesting person.
No.
Interesting person, isn't that it?
That's what people. That's what.
Glenn is an interesting.
Well, that's their big problem on their side. The only one who's got potential, I think, there is Hart.
Cranston, good God. 30 seconds. It's ridiculous. Shouldn't even be in the Senate.
Fritz Hollings.
Huh?
Fritz Hollings can't even understand him.
Like Bernie Maybank.
How
I think the hair thing, they should be done properly, but what I was thinking with Downey, it looks so artificial, all pasted, you know. He's got a bad hairdo, man. I think.
How acrimonious was the kitchen debate? Did he get mad at you? Did you get mad at him?
No, I do not think it was a question of anger, certainly not on my part. After all, I was the host, and I didn't want to have an international incident on a goodwill trip, which this was supposed to be, basically.
You had to suppress that because you were the host, but did it annoy you? Did you feel that he was going outside the bounds of propriety or protocol, or were you just fascinated by it?
More the latter. I really expected him to be, as I said, very unpredictable and going to take advantage all the way that he possibly could. I recall one of the favorite anecdotes of Chancellor Adenauer. He said that Khrushchev was trying to bully him when Adenauer had been in Moscow. And when Adenauer made what Adenauer thought was a very reasonable proposal, Khrushchev said, "You can go to hell." And Adenauer said, "Well, if I go to hell, you'll be there to meet me when I get there." And what he was really trying to tell me, Adenauer, by that anecdote was, don't let him get away with too much. And so what I had to do was to find a way to respond, but a way to respond without creating an international incident, and also one that would maintain my hospitality as a host. And I think I finally was able to accomplish that fairly well.
Do you think he was genuinely out of control, or was he calculating the effect of what he was doing as he was doing it?
No question about the latter. He is a man that does not lose his temper. He uses his temper, and he did throughout. He puts on a show, but he is cold when it matters. He's also one who never really is under the influence of alcohol, or wasn't when he made any decisions. He was a pretty good drinker. But when it really mattered, after we had luncheon later, whenever we were having any substantive discussions out of the Datcha, we sat there for 4 or 5 hours, 5, 6 hours, as I recall, and he sipped hardly anything at all. When it really counts, he's cold, sober, and when it really counts, as I say, he is not one that lets his temper run away with him. He was very calculating, and so he was deliberately probably trying to provoke me, but also trying to show off for the great numbers of the American press were there, his belief that the Soviet Union, if it was behind the United States economically, was going to catch up because its system was superior. He believed that then. And second, that as far as military strength is concerned, that he had missiles on the way that were going to give him superiority over the United States.
Because the actual kitchen debate was spontaneous and unexpected, there is only the briefest 7-8 second film clip of the two of you standing at the rail looking into the kitchen. That became a fairly famous photograph or picture because of some of the other people involved.
Well, that was where the real kitchen debate took place, not before the television cameras in the television studio that had been set up earlier that we've already seen. And there, as you will note from the photograph, you will see the man standing on his left is a young party worker. His name was Brezhnev. I didn't know till I met Brezhnev in 1972. I didn't know until then that Brezhnev was the man that was in that photograph. Because when you go to the Soviet Union, at least at a high level as I did, you don't talk to anybody but the top man, or two men, if the case might be, if there's another one like a Kosygin along with the Brezhnev that you talk to. When I talked to Khrushchev, except for an occasional word with Mikoyan, one of his deputies, I didn't talk to anybody else. And so Brezhnev was there, and I wasn't even aware of who he was. He didn't peep once during this whole conversation, but he watched it very, very closely and was fascinated by it, as I'm sure most everybody else was.
You had done a lot of studying of Khrushchev, and you talked to Macmillan and Adenauer and Dulles, and pored over CIA and State Department profiles of him. Do you think he'd studied you? Do you think he'd done the same?
Oh, I'm rather confident that he had. Not quite the same in one sense, though. He was going certainly to do that when he went to see President Eisenhower, and that trip was being laid on right while I was there in Moscow. But I was, after all, one that he knew was not able to negotiate with him. But I think he knew something about my background. He knew that I was a lawyer, for example. He knew that I had grown up in a relatively poor family, although he never liked to admit that I was as poor as he was at occasion. And he knew that I'd been in the Congress, and he also knew that I had a reputation as being an anti-communist, because he used to say to me, he said, you know, you don't know anything about communism and so forth, except the fear of it.
The fear of it, yes. That was an exchange in the first debate, wasn't it?
That was in the first debate. But when you come to the second
you told him he mustn't be afraid of ideas.
Well, no, what I said was something a little different from that. I said yes, I indicated that there should be an exchange of ideas. And I said, after all, and this is what really set him off, I said, you don't know everything. And then he snapped right back, well, you don't know anything except about communism, except the fear of communism. Coming back, though, to the kitchen debate, there, after having talked about the relative progress in color television in the first controversy, and then after having talked about shopkeepers being thieves in the second, we looked at the model grocery store, and after having talked about washing machines at the earlier part of the so-called kitchen debate, we finally got down to what this whole visit was about, as it finally turned out, and that was the relative military strength of the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was there that he insisted that as far as their missile strength was concerned, that they were strong. He accused us, the United States, of attempting to use our strength in order to blackmail him and bulldoze him and so forth and so on. And it was simply a hammer and tongs interchange with regard to the relative military strength of the Soviet Union and the United States. The point that I made, however, and again, I felt it was very important to emphasize this rather than to get into a debate as to who had the most missiles or the most planes or the most submarines. The point I made was that that missed the point, that what really mattered was that we should recognize that both were strong, and that was the basis then for negotiation on the basis of equality. But it was very hard to get that across to him because he kept repeating that our military people did not accept that proposition, that all they wanted was superiority.
Did you get the sense, or at what point did you get the sense that this was political dynamite for you, that this confrontation with the leader of the Soviet Union was going to have a tremendous political impact at home where you were already gearing up for the presidential election in 2 years?
No, I didn't have that feeling at the time. Frankly, all I was doing was simply counterpunching. I wasn't going for a knockout, and under the circumstances, therefore, I didn't have any time to think about whether it's going to have some political effect in the United States. I just wanted to be sure that I properly represented the views of the administration, the views of President Eisenhower, and the position of the American people in this first historic meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union. And also that I did not get engaged in, and I repeat again, to meeting him on his ground, of arguing about who had the most, et cetera, and who threatened the other, but trying to put it over on our ground, that was beside the point, that we both had to recognize that we were strong and respect each other for that strength, and then negotiate on areas like Berlin, which was then the major subject of confrontation between the two.
At the Datcha on the river after the boat ride, you came up and saw a long table set under the trees for luncheon, almost a Chekhovian scene, peaceful, bucolic. And as the luncheon progressed, he began an eerie nuclear confrontation.
Well, before the nuclear confrontation evolved, we should point out that he was the perfect host. He joked with Mikoyan, who was seated beside Mrs. Nixon, and he noted that Mikoyan was talking to her, and he said, "Look, you crafty Armenian, don't you try to monopolize Mrs. Nixon." And then he drew his line across the table between Mrs. Nixon and Mikoyan. He said, "Look, this is an iron curtain. Don't you step across it. She belongs to me." So I thought this was going to be a very pleasant meeting, and that after we finished our lunch that he and I would probably go to one of the conference rooms in the Datcha and have a meeting. But it didn't work out that way. The conversation went on and on. Incidentally, we were well prepared for it, however, or at least I say that we were fortified, because one of the earlier courses was a great delicacy. He described it to me as being a frozen Siberian white fish. And he said that it was Stalin's favorite fish because it gave him steel in his backbone, and he took a couple of helpings of it, and I took a couple of helpings as well. I think it helped us both to survive 4 hours of conversation, which was toe-to-toe all the way.
Wasn't this fish that in fact was raw and had rotted, and that one of the reasons it was supposed to put steel up your backbone was because if you could stand the smell, that you could stand anything?
I didn't notice the smell particularly. All I noticed is that we loaded it down with onions, and it didn't make any difference how it tasted.
How do you handle when you're, say, in the Mideast and a sheep's eye is presented to you as the guest of honor? Do you eat it with relish?
Eat it, that's right.
Or with onions?
That's right. Eat it with relish. I've eaten sheep's eyes, and in China, as a matter of fact, on one occasion I recall having their famous Mao Tai. It was green, and after I had some of it, this was in one of the provinces, my host, with a delightful look in his eye, said, well, that had snake's venom in it. So.
Did it make you meaner?
No.
Yeah. Have you had Rocky Mountain oysters?
Oh, yes. I've had that in the United States, in the Ozarks. And incidentally, they're very good. They taste like scallops, really. I mean, they're very nice.
What happened during this Datcha conversation?
Well, what happened was that after we got past some of the amenities at the beginning, he then began to carry on where we had left off in the so-called kitchen debate about the relative strength of the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think, while we went into a number of areas, insofar as missiles are concerned, he made, what to me was a very, in a way, frightening statement or observation. He said that he favored developing missiles and relying on them rather than airplanes. He said the difficulty with airplanes and using pilots to drop bombs is that you have the human factor, and sometimes a pilot might not want to drop an atomic bomb. He says with missiles you don't have that human factor, you just fire them. It's much more impersonal. Then he went on to say that he had no use for navies, whatever. He said in the missile age, he said navies are going to become obsolete. He said ships will simply be fodder for sharks. He always spoke in very colorful terms. The same was true of aircraft. He said as far as aircraft is concerned, they're going to become irrelevant as well. He says they'll just be sitting ducks for the missiles that we're going to develop. So he talked in pretty frightening terms, incidentally, with regard to missile strength and the rest.
What were your impressions of the Soviet people that you met on this trip?
You're talking about the leaders?
No, the people themselves outside of the...
Well, I think I have often made the point that when we talk about communist leaders and the people who live in the countries that they lead, we must always differentiate. As a matter of fact, you've got to take the leader and look at him as two people. He is a communist, and in the case of Russia, he's a Russian. And sometimes he acts like a Russian and sometimes like a communist. You must have in mind always that when things really count, he's going to be a lot more communist than he is Russian.
Were you prepared for the reaction that you got in Poland on your way home?
No, not at all. And in fact, we didn't expect any kind of a reaction at all in Poland because we had understood before we stopped there that the Polish government had not published the parade route, the motorcade route, I should say, from the airport to the guest house that we were going to stay in. And it was a Sunday. We thought that most of the people on their one day off a week would be doing something other than coming out and gawking at a vice president coming in after a trip to Moscow. And the first indication that I got that it would be a little different there than it had been in Moscow, let me say parenthetically that when we got out of Moscow on that trip, we found that in Leningrad and in Novosibirsk, in the heart of Siberia, and also in Sverdlovsk, we found a great outpouring of warmth from the Russian people, as distinguished from the leaders themselves. In any event, the first indication that I got that we're going to be different in Poland is when the honor guard, the Polish honor guard, were loaded on a flat bed truck. And as we were leaving the airport to drive into the city, I saw the honor guard personnel. Some of them were clapping, and some of them were holding up the V sign like that. And I just thought, as I went by them, that they wouldn't be very reliable troops in the event that there was a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then once we got into the streets, something hit the side of the car, and I thought it might have been a stone or something of that sort, as it had been in Caracas just a year before. But it was a bouquet of roses. And then flowers began to pelt the motorcade all the way in. There was 250,000 people there, totally spontaneous. Those who observe it, and I agree, while it was not the biggest crowd we have been welcomed by, it was certainly the most emotional that I have ever seen, and one that moved us beyond belief.
Were the Polish leaders embarrassed by it?
Oh, yes. I think they were very embarrassed and somewhat surprised because they didn't want, not because I think really they would have minded having their people welcome an American in that way, but also primarily because they didn't want to irritate the Russians, because what had happened is Khrushchev had just been in Poland about a few weeks before that, and they had tried to put on a big welcome for him. And it was very amusing that when members of the press asked the people that had thrown flowers into the cars, asked them about it, they said that this time we bought our own flowers. The other time, when Khrushchev came in, the state had bought the flowers for them and told them to throw them into the cars, and some of them didn't even throw it in then. It's the old story, too. You can really tell about the difference between crowds. I remember in 1974, when we went into Cairo, there was a huge crowd, over 1 million people on the way from the airport into the guest house. And they were cheering and chanting and smiling and laughing. And Sadat said to me, he says, they are cheering for you. They're cheering for the United States. He says, you know, we can always get out a crowd, but you can't make them smile. And so it was in Poland. This was a smiling crowd, but not all smiling. I would say hundreds of them had tears running down their cheeks because they were simply moved with joy that an American was there. There's a strong feeling among the Polish people about Americans generally, probably because so many of their relatives live in the United States.
What do you think you represented to them?
Hope. Hope that they might have an opportunity someday not to have a Soviet-controlled or subsidized government imposed upon themselves, and also respect and affection. the United States to them is a nation that offers freedom, hope. It's what they would like their own country to be.
When Khrushchev made his visit to the United States the next year, I think he made it clear on several occasions that you were not one of his very favorite people.
Oh yes, he took every opportunity to embarrass me, as the case might be. Right from the time we met in the White House in the Oval Office of the President Eisenhower, he said to President Eisenhower that while he didn't have any question about President Eisenhower's desire for peace, he did have a question about my desire for peace. He didn't say that specifically, but he said, some of the people around you, we don't have that same confidence, and he glared at me in the process. The same was true when we went up to Camp David. We got up there, and we were meeting with President Eisenhower in Aspen, which is the presidential cottage there. And Khrushchev was very belligerent as long as I was present because he felt that I had not been friendly in speeches that I had made to the American Legion and the VFW 2 weeks before he arrived there, because I had referred to my own visit to the Soviet Union and so forth. What he missed, the point he missed, was that in those speeches I had urged those organizations, both of which were going to pass resolutions condemning his visit, I had urged them to give him a friendly welcome. But he just overlooked that and considered me to be beyond the pale in that respect. And consequently, President Eisenhower very properly suggested that I not participate in the meetings thereafter, but it was just more of the same then. He was just as tough with Eisenhower as he was with me. The famous Eisenhower smile and so forth didn't work, which was no surprise to Eisenhower. He's a pretty realistic fellow. Incidentally, we had one amusing anecdote in that respect. We were having luncheon, and I was trying to, lighten things up a bit after a very heavy conversation that had occurred previously. And I asked Khrushchev, I said, where do you go on your vacations? He says, I like to go to the Crimea. And President Eisenhower said, well, I always like to go down to Georgia, like to play golf and so forth. He says, the only problem, though, is that when I go on vacation, I am always interrupted by the telephone. Translation was made, and Khrushchev took umbrage about that. He says, well, we have telephones in the Soviet Union, too. We don't have as many as you do, but we're going to have more. We'll pass you in that way, too. So you see, every opportunity, he had this inferiority complex, and he was determined to show that the Soviet Union, while behind now, was going to prevail in the end and pass the United States, as he put it.
What was Eisenhower's impression of this rather spontaneous and belligerent man?
Well, his impression was that of a realist, I would say. He had to listen to those, and there were some of his advisors who felt that maybe, just maybe, that he could reassure Khrushchev and dispel some of the doubts that Khrushchev had about the United States being a threat to him. But Eisenhower saw through it very soon. After the Camp David meeting, when they were unable to get any kind of a statement out, well, the statement they got out later was referred to as a spirit of Camp David, which was a nothing thing. They couldn't agree on anything. Eisenhower, frankly, gave up on him.
Rather than dispelling his doubts about whether we might have been a threat to him, wouldn't it have been better to reinforce those concerns?
Well, let me make it very clear. I think after Eisenhower had gone the extra mile in making it clear that we were seeking peaceful resolution of Berlin and other issues, that Eisenhower, by that cold manner of his, which he makes very apparent at times, left no doubt in Khrushchev's mind that Eisenhower was not one that could be pushed around. But I would say the main thing that impressed Khrushchev was sending him around the United States, because he was enormously impressed, I am sure, by the thousands and thousands of cars that he saw in parking lots, by the houses that he saw, etc. He came back convinced that the United States was not a paper tiger. And incidentally, he passed that on to the Chinese, and that may have been one of the reasons for the Sino-Soviet split, although there were others as well.
How did, in these meetings, how did Eisenhower's cool manner reflect itself?
Well, more by what he didn't say than what he did say. Eisenhower was not one to engage in a lot of rhetoric with people, but he would just become, when he didn't agree, he just put on the silent act. He was very...
Did it have an effect on Khrushchev? Did he seem to withdraw?
Khrushchev didn't know what to do with it. I was not present at all the meetings, of course. I was only present at the initial ones. But from what I had heard later, Eisenhower just felt that he was intransigent, and so he gave up on that, at least diplomacy course at the present time.
Is it true that you had the distinction of being the man who introduced Khrushchev to Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI?
Yes. As a matter of fact, that was at a dinner, and they were both invited to at the White House, the state dinner. And I remember when I introduced him to Hoover, he immediately perked up and he says, "I think we know some of the same people." I think the reason he said that was that Hoover, of course, is well known, had always told the Congress that he had people planted within the Soviet KGB, a double agent.
Did he, do you think?
Oh, no question about it. Oh, as a matter of fact, Hoover used to tell me that both before the presidential years and even before that, that they had a man, a double agent, who used to bring $100,000 a year to the Communist Party in the United States. That was his job to bring it. He was the bag man. Now, on the other hand, that man might have been a double agent the other way too, so who knows what. But I think it was a very astute comment on Khrushchev's part. We know some of the same people, so don't trust anybody.
Was there unified support behind the trip? Was John Foster Dulles, for example, in favor of Khrushchev's coming here?
Well, Dulles, by that time, was no longer living, of course. The decision with regard to his coming here was made later. Dulles did support my going there because he had been present at a meeting I had had at the F Street Club, a fine private club in Washington, where Mikoyan was present. And he felt that I had handled myself rather well in a, quote, debate or discussion with Mikoyan, a very clever, intelligent, tough-minded second man to Khrushchev. And Dulles gave me excellent advice with regard to how to handle the meetings when I got to Khrushchev. He was the one who said over and over again, he said, "I could not agree more with those," because all sorts of columns are written when it was announced I was going to go to Russia, that if I could only reassure the Russians that we were for peace and dispel some of their fears that they were being encircled in the rest, that would serve the cause of peace. And Dulles, it was he who said, "Don't ever believe that." He said, we don't have to convince them we're for peace. They know that.
Khrushchev later said that he had done everything he could to defeat you in the race for president in 1960. What do you think he meant by that?
I think one of the things he meant apparently was that he did not release some American crewmen, a flight crew, that had come down in the Soviet Union when they got off course. And under the circumstances, that might have had some effect. I mean, had he released them before the election, that could have helped. I think another point that he was perhaps making was that after the U-2 incident, that he did not go forward with the plans to have Eisenhower visit the Soviet Union. I think, incidentally, that was a great loss. I think Eisenhower would have had a great impact in the Soviet Union, and I think the reason that Khrushchev had it knocked over, my visit had been quite effective. I think he feared having Eisenhower come to the Soviet Union for the impact that Eisenhower would have on the Russian people. And so I think also Khrushchev felt that his conduct when he was in this country, conduct indicating that he couldn't get along with me, might frighten American people to voting against me because of the fear that I couldn't get along with Khrushchev. I remember Mrs. Herder, the wife of who who succeeded Dulles, Secretary Chris Herter, a former congressman, that she said to me on one occasion that, this is before the election, that she, in talking to many of her friends, had heard over and over again the concern expressed that because Khrushchev and I didn't get along, that we might not be able to make progress toward peace. Of course, that missed the point altogether. Getting along with Khrushchev does not mean being belligerent, whether it's with him or any other Russian leader, but it does mean being strong. War is going to come, or defeat without war, which is the greater likelihood, not because we are strong, but because we are weak, and because we give the impression to the Soviet leaders that they can make gains without some cost to them. It's only when they become determined that the cost of war is going to be far greater than anything they could gain that we will have any meaningful negotiations to reduce its danger.
If you had to lay odds on the likelihood of a major great power war, say in the next 20 years, what odds would you choose?
I don't think there's going to be a war. I wouldn't want to bet on such a thing because I don't want to lose that bet, or win it for that matter. I don't think there's going to be a major war for a number of reasons. First, because taking the Soviet leaders at their most aggressive worst, whatever that may be, they are not fools. They are not madmen. An Andropov is not a Hitler, just as Brezhnev was not and Khrushchev was not. So I think under the circumstances, we're going to find that they have some incentive to avoid war. They want to conquer the world. They want communism to dominate the world, but not a world of destroyed cities and of dead bodies. So they want to win without war. That is what they're trying to do, and that is the great danger that we confront. Now, having said that I do not believe there will be a war, there are two conditions. One, that the United States continue to develop the military strength across the board that will deter Soviet military action. And second, and this is even more critical, in the peripheral areas, I'm referring to the Mideast, to Latin America, to Southeast Asia, as distinguished from Europe, where I think there will not be a major Soviet offensive there. In those peripheral areas, to find ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union can negotiate about their differences there, having in mind the fact that we're never going to agree. All we can ever agree upon with the Soviet is how can we be adversaries without allowing our adversarial relationship escalate into war, and that is possible.
You say that Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Andropov are not crazed like Hitler was. Are they less evil than he was?
In the sense that certainly what we would call Hitler's mania with regard to the Holocaust that was visited upon the Jewish population, not only of Germany but the rest of Europe. You do not have that mania in the Soviet Union, although they are anti-Semitic. Most of the Russian leaders that I have met deep down are anti-Semitic. As far as repression is concerned, I do not think that the Soviet Union has been any less repressive than Hitler's Germany was. Millions have been killed by Stalin. In later years, however, not as much. So consequently, it's changed to that extent.
How would the Soviet leaders you've met and dealt with indicate or demonstrate their anti-Semitism?
Oh, just by a comment here and there, but not so much by what they did demonstrate, but by, why don't you repeat that question, because I don't think that makes the point. Make it again.
How did the Soviet leaders that you've met indicate or express or demonstrate their anti-Semitism?
Nothing in what they said, but really in what they did. terms of their attitude toward Jewish immigration. They simply set up barriers which were almost impossible to overcome. And I would say that as far as the progress we made during the period of so-called détente, that there we'd had considerable success, but only because we convinced them that it was in their interest to lower the barriers which allowed Jews to emigrate so that they could accomplish progress on other fronts. I just used to make privately, and in every meeting I had with them in 72, 73, and 74, I would emphasize the point that their intransigence on Jewish immigration had a very detrimental effect on my ability to get support for progress in other areas that had to do with détente. And that had its effect, because when we came into office, for example, in 1969, the year before, only 600 Jews were allowed to emigrate. In 1973, it got up to 30,000. In 1974, of course, it went down again because the Congress passed the Jackson-Bannock Amendment, which openly conditioned Jewish immigration on Soviet conduct, and that was a mistake.
You were under tremendous domestic political pressure to raise that issue. Considered objectively, do you think that the issue of Jewish immigration was important enough to have used it to sort of pull in your détente chips on that issue?
I was interested in results. I wasn't interested in making a big political ploy out of the fact that I was hammering on the table in my meetings with Brezhnev and demanding that Jews be allowed to emigrate. I knew that doing that would have a counterproductive effect. And it has had a counterproductive effect. It did have whenever that kind of practice was followed. I knew the best way to get them to cooperate would be to do it privately, very, very firmly, but making it clear that it was in their interest because of their concern about progress on other issues to be more liberal insofar as immigration was concerned. I was never able to get that across to most of the people in the American Jewish community, unfortunately. I never got much credit for what we were able to accomplish, because sometimes I'm afraid people would prefer to have the issue rather than progress in doing and resolving the issue.
If it weren't for the domestic political pressure, would you have raised it? Would you have considered, with Brezhnev, would you have considered it objectively an important enough issue to have taken a lot of time and to have demanded or required or made it a condition for other concessions or other arrangements?
Let's make it very clear. I never made it a condition. I didn't believe it should be a condition. It was an internal matter within the Soviet Union. However, I did feel that under the circumstances it was important from a very personal standpoint, knowing the situation there, from a moral standpoint to make progress on it. And I thought it was in the interest of the Soviet Union itself to make progress on that issue.
Getting back to the 1960 election, you say that your ability to get along with Khrushchev really had nothing to do with your ability to lead the country or the two countries to war or peace. But that would have been a very potent political issue, the idea that Khrushchev had spread the word through his actions or through his words that he couldn't get along with you, that therefore you would be a risky leader. Was that used against you in the campaign? Was that an issue, or did the Kennedy forces spread that word? Mrs. Herter was on your side, but if it had reached that level, it must have reached the other side.
No, as a matter of fact, when Khrushchev told Kennedy that he in effect had supported Kennedy in the campaign and had voted for him and so forth and so on, I think he really meant what he had said, that he did favor Kennedy over me, because he had taken my measure and he was convinced that while I might turn out to be reasonable, I would be very, very hard to push over. He would never have tried with me what he did to Kennedy at Vienna, you know, where when Kennedy met with him in their first, and as a matter of fact, their only summit, he would never have been able to do that with me. But be that as it may, I do not think it had a detrimental effect as far as that very close campaign in 1960 was concerned. It might have had the contrary effect, because when Kennedy raised the issue that the United States, that President Eisenhower ought to consider apologizing to Khrushchev for the U-2 incident. I was able to nail him on that issue, and he had to back down from it. No, the American people in 1960 weren't that dovish. They wanted a strong president. As a matter of fact, ironically, Kennedy gained not from being more dovish than I did, but from appearing to be more hawkish on the issue of Cuba. Because in our last debate, as some will recall, he advocated that the United States should support the forces of liberation inside and outside of Cuba. And I had to take the position, which was against what I really believed, that the United States shouldn't do that because I knew we were already doing it. It was a covert CIA operation which later ended up in the disaster of the Bay of Pigs because it wasn't carried out the way that Eisenhower had laid it down. And I think that that very issue, any one of a number of issues could make a difference of the 12,000 votes shift that would have determined the different president in 1960, but that very issue certainly disconcerted some of my strong anti-communist supporters when they thought that I was softer on Castro than Kennedy, and it was just the other way around.
What happened when Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna?
I was, of course, not privy to the conversations, but I did read a report by James Reston on it, and Reston said that Khrushchev was brutal, belligerent, as he had been in this picture that we saw here, and that it shook Kennedy. Now, Reston was a supporter of President Kennedy, and I don't mean that Kennedy was frightened, but I do mean that it caused him considerable concern, and under the circumstances, he had to regain and recoup in some way. And that may have been one of the reasons why the Cuban confrontation became absolutely essential. He couldn't leave an impression after that meeting in Vienna that Khrushchev could bully him.
It's widely believed that Khrushchev took away the impression from that meeting that Kennedy was in fact not a strong leader, and that did lead him to probe and to test
to put the missiles
further.
into Cuba.
If you had been president in 1961, he would have had prior experience of you and would have known that you were not that way. Does it follow that there wouldn't have been a Cuban Missile Crisis? Does it also follow from what you've said that there would have been a Bay of Pigs, but it would have been successful because you would have carried it out as it was originally planned?
Well, of course, I'm not the best witness on that. Certainly the Bay of Pigs would have been carried out very differently. Once we committed the United States, we would certainly not have allowed that particular venture to fail, particularly when it's right next door. There was no excuse. It wasn't many, many miles away. It was right next door, and we had the capability within the area through air support and so forth to make that succeed. And once we had taken that step, and Eisenhower had that same view. He said he would never have approved an operation of that sort without air support. As far as the Cuban confrontation is concerned, my guess is that Khrushchev would have been quite unlikely to have tried to sneak missiles into Cuba if he felt that he had to deal with me. And incidentally, after that confrontation, Kennedy's hand was strengthened with Khrushchev. Let me say in that respect, too, when you look at the difference between Khrushchev and Brezhnev, my guess is that Brezhnev would not have put missiles into Cuba. Khrushchev was a greater gambler. He was more emotional. And more emotional and more of a risk taker than Brezhnev. Brezhnev was more cautious. That would be my guess, just in retrospect.
Why did Kennedy, who was not weak in terms of his perception of the communist threat and was a military man himself and was not averse to the application of force, why did he let the Bay of Pigs fail?
Bad advice. I think that if he had followed his own instincts, he would never have let it fail. But he caught a lot of hell from his more liberal advisors. They were divided on it, Adlai Stevenson and some of the rest. And so under the circumstances, Kennedy felt that, well, once it became known that it was an American-supported initiative, that we mustn't go too far. And that, of course, is a great, great mistake. I remember Churchill wrote in his volume on the First World War, multi-volume work on the First World War, he said that a commander in war can either follow a policy of audacity or one of caution, but he must not follow one that tries to be both. And in this case, the audacious policy was the only one that could succeed there. And by mixing it with the policy of restraint, it failed on both sides.
You had known Kennedy for numbers of years. Was it characteristic of him to vacillate and to be indecisive and to sort of mix conflicting advice and come out with a?
No, not characteristic at all.
Why did he do
I think
it then
it was.
on the
I
most
think it was
important issue?
No, it wasn't characteristic. It would have been characteristic, for example, of Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson basically was a Hamlet-like person. He always commiserated about and talked about all these decisions, difficult decisions he had to make and so forth. He was very thoughtful, but it was very hard for him to decide anything. Eisenhower was a decisive man. He made great decisions, not off the top of his head and not impetuously, but after consideration he decided something and it was done. Kennedy was also decisive. But Kennedy, in those early years, sat on what I would say a somewhat schizophrenic group of advisors. Some were hawkish, so to speak. Those who supported, for example, what he said in his inaugural speech to the effect, "We will fight any place, anywhere, in defense of freedom," and so forth. And when he went to Berlin, "We are all Berliners," and so forth and so on. Now, these were very strong statements, in fact, statements that put the United States on the line, and perhaps in areas that we would not be able even to support. We didn't have the ability to do so, but they were made. On the other hand, he had advisors who felt that this was the time to have a more conciliatory attitude toward the Soviet Union. And Kennedy, in that early period, I think, ran into that problem. And President Johnson had the same problem. Some of Kennedy's more dovish advisors stayed on with Johnson, and Johnson, as a result, reaped the detriments of both worlds by failing to have a policy that was aggressive enough and strong enough to bring the war in Vietnam to a successful conclusion earlier.
Did you try to get to President Kennedy either with advice about how to deal with Khrushchev based on your experience, or to urge him to follow through on the Bay of Pigs plan as it had originally been conceived?
I saw him right after the Bay of Pigs, and he asked what would I recommend, and I said, well, I would go in now. I said I would find some reason to go in. For example, perhaps something that Castro is doing to our base there in Cuba, or something of that sort, but find some reason to go in. But I said I would certainly try to find a way to go in now. And Kennedy said he had thought of that, but that some of his advisors had urged him not to do so because they thought that Khrushchev was in a very, very cocky mood at the moment, and that if we did something in Cuba, he might do something in Berlin. Now, the point about all that, where I think his advisors were wrong, is that Khrushchev was not a madman either. He was one that would take risks. He was bold. But on the other hand, he, at that time, knew that the United States had a preemptive first strike capability against the Soviet Union. Despite all of his huffing and puffing about his missiles, we had at least a 15-to-1 advantage in the Kennedy years. And we were looking down their throat. He wouldn't about have gone into Berlin or any place else knowing that the United States could knock out his nuclear capability with a preemptive strike. And so I think that those that were frightened or fearful of what Khrushchev would do simply missed the mark. He was going to talk big, but when it came to action, he would never have called Kennedy's hand. Not in Berlin, and certainly not in Cuba.
There's a fascinating short film of you taken in the Oval Office with Kennedy when you went to visit him at the time of the Bay of Pigs. What kind of spirits did you find him in? Was he up, or was he depressed? Was he worried?
Well, he was worried, of course, as he is expectedly. He was, and of course, he was looking at some of the things that had gone wrong, and he was really taking off at his advisors, and I didn't blame him a bit. He thought that he'd gotten bad advice from the military, he'd gotten bad advice from the CIA and everybody else. But Allen Dulles, you know, when he saw me the day of the Bay of Pigs, in fact the day before I saw Kennedy in the Oval Office, he took the responsibility and the blame as any big man would. He said, I almost told the president. And I said, I will never forgive myself for not doing it. I almost told him that if he makes this decision to go in, it must not fail. But I didn't do so.
Do you believe that he didn't in fact tell him?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think he did not tell him. You know, because there was no question. Allen Dulles was in a very emotional state at that time. I remember he came to the door. He was coming there to brief me because I was going to take a trip later abroad. And I asked him if he'd like a drink, and I said, I certainly need one. I didn't know at that time it had failed. And I said, well, what has happened? And they said, this is the blackest day in my life. The whole operation has failed. We have lost everything. He did make the point, too. He said, now, Kennedy was very courageous in overruling some of his dovish advisors and going in the first place. And then Allen Dulles took the responsibility. He says, I didn't tell him that it must not fail, and I should have.
How would things have been different if the Bay of Pigs invasion had succeeded?
Well, it's rather iffy to even speculate about such a question. Certainly, it would have meant that we wouldn't have the problems we have today in Central America. After all, it isn't what Castro has done to Cuba. It's the fact of what Castro has done outside of Cuba. Cuba is a Soviet base in the Americas. And so he is exporting his revolution and making trouble in Central America and other countries. And also, Castro is a willing proxy puppet of the Soviet Union. Why are Cuban troops in Angola? Why are they in Ethiopia? Why are they in other countries in Africa? Who's paying for it? The Russians. And if you didn't have Castro there, he is the best puppet the Soviet have got. If you didn't have him there, the world would be very different.
It's still hard to figure out why Kennedy, who was a strong and decisive man and who knew that his presidency, the early reputation of his presidency was on the line, allowed himself, after the thing began to clearly fail, to be pulled back and forth still by these by the schizophrenia of his advisors, especially when you consider that someone like Stevenson, according to a number of the memoirs and records of the time, he had great contempt for Stevenson's Hamlet-like qualities and had put him off in the UN so that he would be harmless there. Why did Kennedy have what appears to be a failure of will or decisiveness on this most crucial, vital hemispheric issue?
Well, I can't say why, but I think that is the best explanation. I know that his failure to act there was not because he himself was not a decisive person. He's a strong, tough fellow. There's no question about that. He was tough in his campaigning. His war record would indicate that, certainly. And I don't think there's any question that if he had followed his own intuitions, it would have turned out very differently, but he didn't do so.
Did he pay attention to his presidency? Is it possible that this issue just sort of crept up on him, as a lot of people claim that he never really focused initially, again, was torn by his advisors on Vietnam, and it wasn't until what turned out to be shortly before his death, after the Diem coup, that he really began to focus on Vietnam, and a number of the Kennedy supporters say that he would have been very decisive in getting out of it. He would have, when he had focused on it, he would have seen that it was a bad thing and he would have got out. Is it arguable that he just wasn't concentrating on the Bay of Pigs until it was too late?
I suppose it's arguable, but
was that characteristic
I'm not
of him?
I wouldn't think it would be characteristic, and I would not go along with those who try to say that if Kennedy had only understood what Vietnam was all about, he wouldn't have gone in or wouldn't have got out, or he would have gotten out. He was a world thinker. I know that from knowing him long before he was president. He didn't think in small terms and parochial terms. He knew how important Vietnam was and that our failing there could have massive effects in other parts of the world. He knew that the war in Vietnam wasn't about Vietnam, but it was about Southeast Asia generally and about our relations with the rest of Asia. I just don't believe that that those who are trying to say that he was misled and he was misled and thereby misled the country into supporting the Vietnamese government, sending the first 16,000 combat troops there. I don't go along with that at all.
Did Kennedy ever talk to you about Stevenson?
No. No.
One of the diplomatic hot potatoes that was thrown you at the end of the Eisenhower administration was meeting Castro when he came to Washington. What were your impressions of him? What kind of a man did you find him to be?
Charismatic, intelligent, strong, and also one who had a total lack of understanding of how an economy works. One who I wrote afterwards in a report to President Eisenhower, who was either a communist or totally naive about communism. And I quickly reached the conclusion it was the first.
What made you reach that conclusion?
What he did, his conduct in Cuba, his failing to go forward with regard to elections, his actions against those who had opposed him, the show trials, everything that he did. In other words, there was no question about where he stood.
Wasn't there a lot of anti-Castroism, though, before that became clear in America? A lot of people didn't want to meet him when he came at that time, a lot of political leaders, including the president. And you were sort of sent to feel him out and get an impression. Do you think that if he'd been treated differently, if he'd been accorded more honor and respect and his revolution praised instead of condemned or ignored, that he might have, if not become an ally, at least become a neutral?
Well, we hear that sort of nonsense about Nicaragua, that if only we had treated the new government, the Sandinistas, properly, that they would not have been tilting toward the Soviet Union and so forth and so on, and not have been communist. We hear the same thing with regard to the Soviet Union after World War II, that if only we had been more tolerant and not made them fearful of us, that then they would have come along and helped us build a new era of peace and prosperity and communication in Europe. And on Castro, that if only we had treated him properly, the same with Allende in Cuba, that we could have weaned him away from the communist support. And that isn't the real world. Because when you look at Castro's background, how he came to power and who supported him in that period, there's no question that Castro, in retrospect, was a dedicated communist operative from the beginning. And there's nothing that we could have done that would have changed that.
It's been written that you were one of the principal